Muted. Okay, everyone, I think we'll hit go on this one, and we may expect a few other people to join us later on. Let me welcome you. My name is Vanessa McBride. I'm from the International Science Council. I'm the science director there, but I've only been there for a few months actually. And I'd like to welcome you also on behalf of my colleagues at the Global Young Academy. Beata is here, Carlo is here, and also on behalf of my colleagues at the Inter-Academy Partnership. Rhonda is also here this morning, which is very early for her. And the reason that we're here today is just to talk a little bit more about researcher assessment. It's for the launch of a report that our three organizations collaborated on over the last couple of months. And this report was actually built on a previous report that we released about a year ago, again, a collaboration between the organizations, called The Future of Research Evaluation, a synthesis of current debates and developments. Excuse me. And this report really built on a sort of an overview of what was happening in the landscape. And you may know that quite well as the Orange Report. What we've released now, just a year later, is a community consultation between the communities of these three organizations that really builds on that report. It's called Snapshots of Reform, Research Evaluation within Science Organization. And it looks at how changes are happening within our three organizations and beyond. So just to let you know, if you are hoping to fade into the background today and to just join a Zoom half asleep, that's probably not going to happen. We're a small group of us on today, but also this is part of our community consultation process. So at the end, we hope to leave about 30 minutes for questions and for discussion. So we really would appreciate your input on these ideas. And so with that, let me hand over to my colleague, Carlo Depoliti, who will start us off with an overview of what it is. And then I welcome just later on Ben Bleasdale from Culture Base, who will talk a bit about the methods that were employed. Over to you, Carlo.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carlo Depoliti from Sapienza University of Rome, as well as from the Global Young Academy. I will be providing you my own personal interpretation of the main results of the report, and then with here representing Culture Base that has been drafting the report, will be talking about the methods of the analysis that we've been doing. So just very quickly to give you the context, as Vanessa was already mentioning, we are perceiving a global context of low change. There have been initiatives such as the San Francisco DORA or the European Union Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, the Magic Fight in the UK, and so on. However, this change seems to be partly unconnected and maybe moving in parallel. For this reason, 2 years ago, the three organizations, the Inter-Academy Partnership, International Science Council, and the Global Young Academy, created a scoping group that interviewed a number of stakeholders and then published this Orange Report that Vanessa was mentioning, which is freely available online. The main conclusions of the report were that there was a huge room for collaboration between the three organizations in terms, for example, of sharing good practice, leading by example, building partnerships, as well as providing intellectual leadership. As the first step in this collaboration, the two organizations have decided to launch an analysis of what their own members in the two cases of the IAP and the ISC, and the network of academies in the case of the Global Young Academy, an analysis of what they are doing. These resulted in the new report, which is also freely available online on the three institutions' websites, and I invite everyone to have a look at it, in which Culture Base has helped us looking at how do the members and networks of organizations are currently evaluating researchers, for what reasons, and in which way. So to tell us a little bit more about the findings of this report, I'll leave the word to Ben, and then I will talk again about the main results.
Thanks so much, Carlo. Lovely to speak to everybody today. So as mentioned, I'm Ben Bleasdale. I'm from an agency based in the UK called Culturebase. We really focus on aspects of research culture, so the environment in which researchers work. And we're really excited to work on this particular project, looking specifically at assessment processes. As has already been mentioned, we really explored a whole range of different types of practices across the combined memberships, with the idea of really trying to unpick what practices were happening, what was motivating change, and how progress was being made. So, as mentioned, we really wanted to kind of get under the skin of this issue and really understand how it was playing out across the combined memberships. And there was 3 phases of the work. The first was based around desk-based research. We reviewed organizational websites, online publications, but also wider resources such as things like the DORA resource library, sources of really helpful information on this particular topic. And we used that to build and distribute a survey to the entire combined networks. This was a chance for us to really ask questions about where organizations were at with their progress on this topic, what they saw as the big barriers, the issues, as well as the opportunities. And, a very important caveat with all of this is that it was a voluntary survey. So it went out to several hundred members and we had a really good response, but there is a self-selecting nature to that sample. And we've been very open about that in the report. That does create limitations on the data, but at the same time does give us a really useful and helpful picture of different types of practices. And then finally, we complemented the quantitative analysis through the survey with a series of targeted interviews. We were very lucky to have a total of 12 organizations across the memberships who gave their time, and we had fantastic conversations about some of those kind of more detailed nuances about their approach to this particular topic. And we were able to gather those from across different geographies, across different disciplines, and from across different affiliations. So we were able to combine all of those 3 different data sources to produce the report that's been shared with you today. In terms of who responded to the survey, we were really pleased to get a broad selection of different types of members across the 3 organizations. As you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap, which is really helpful for us. But we were able to gather enough insight to be able to look at the different perspectives across these areas. I've added a few examples down the right-hand side there, just to give you a sense of the kind of breadth of different geographic representation. But with 54 responses in total, we were really pleased to have a really good, strong, robust data set to be able to dig into with this and to really look at some of the differences that were starting to play out in how organizations were approaching this particular topic. Also important to us was that we made sure that we were able to look at this across different disciplines. And again, we were really pleased to get a balance of disciplinary strengths across the different samples. For us, it was particularly important that we made sure that we were including non-STEM representation in this, as often that's lost in some of these sorts of sampling. And as you can see, we were really pleased actually to get a very well-balanced disciplinary sample, which again gave us a chance to look at how this challenge is playing out in different disciplines, which I think does have an important effect on researcher assessment. And just to give you a little bit more insight into the interviews as well, these were around 60 minutes long, although some ran longer because people really enjoyed talking to us, which was great. Lots to talk about in this area. And we were able to use these interviews as a chance to dig into some of the trends and look at some of the kind of case studies that are playing out in different parts of the world. We were really pleased as well to be able to do some of these as joint interviews, and so particularly to highlight just one of those from the Netherlands, where we were able to interview both the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences as well as the Young Academy. And that gave a really rich conversation about how those 2 organizations work really closely together on assessment and their vision for the future. So we were able to kind of really dig into some of that collaborative nature, even within single interviews. And it's certainly true that that idea about cooperation and the importance of collaboration came out incredibly strongly through the entire report. And finally, before I hand back over to Carlo, just to highlight the structure of the report itself. So we had an enormous amount of information, which was fantastically useful, and we chose to break that up across 5 big chapters. These, first of all, start out by looking at the nature of evaluation practices, so exploring where and why members are evaluating researchers and what impact that has on the process. We were then able to dig into some of the perceived challenges. So what are the internal or perhaps external barriers that members are experiencing to changing practices in this field? And then linked to that is the appetite for change. So what was driving organizations to engage with reform? Was that coming from internal drivers? Was that coming from external encouragement? And to really dig into how that differed again across the world. And then we looked at levers for action. So what mechanisms did organizations have? What agency did they have? What power in the system to be able to drive change? And how were they working with others to achieve that in a harmonized way? And finally, you'll see at the very end of the report, we've tried to wrap up a lot of the information we've gathered in a sense of what are the different support needs across the memberships. It was really important to us that we recognize that reform is very much a curve. People are at different places on that process. And we really wanted to recognize that the needs for support across those different groups differ, and that it's actually really important that we offer what we possibly can to the organizations that really need it in different ways. So what you'll see at the end is a typology of support needs, which breaks up the combined membership into groups and looks at them as having particular types of support needs which organizations might want to consider. So at that point, I will hand back over to Carlo to share some of the results with you.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Well, in terms of the main findings that you will find in the report, which again is freely available online, I think it's appropriate to start by contextualizing what kind of answers the respondents gave in terms of, for example, why are they engaging in this? So, as we can see, the vast majority of members or network organizations that were conducted engage in research evaluation, especially for the election of new fellows or new members of their organization. A significant one, more than half, sorry, a significant part, more than half, also engaged in research evaluation, for example, of
Sorry to interrupt, Carlo.
Sorry?
Carlo, maybe if you can just speak up, your sound is coming in and out a little bit.
I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's
okay.
better, thanks.
I was mentioning the vast majority of respondents engage in research evaluation for the aim of electing their own fellows or members, even though half of the sample more or less also engages, for example, in awarding prizes. So these are the main reasons for evaluating researcher of the organization in a network. In terms of methods, a first result, which is always worth highlighting, is that there is a wide diversity of methods that the organization use, often, of course, many more than one at once. These range from considering a wide set of activities and contributions, from teaching to outreach and even media contributions. However, there is also a very strong, and unfortunately it comes on top in terms of frequency, a very strong presence of more traditional ways of assessing research, such as, for example, journal level metrics, publication level metrics, or number of papers and age index of authors. This is important because, as we'll see in a second, there is actually a strong debate about these methods. So, do the member organizations and the network engage in reflecting on how, when, and why they should evaluate researchers? A first result is that half of the sample basically doesn't really reflect, half does. So there are, for example, periodic reviews of the assessment processes in, let's say, every even less than a year or every few years for 1/3 of the sample, whereas half of the sample only does when needed. In terms of who is involved in reflecting or reviewing the research assessment processes, of course, the leadership of the organization come on top in terms of frequency. Unfortunately, in my view, maybe the individuals who really frequently involved in this discussion.
Hello. Sorry
Yes.
to just interrupt again, but I think it's not only me who's struggling to hear you. I think, can you try an alternate sound input?
Apologies again. Does it work better this way?
It's a huge amount better, actually.
Okay, I apologize.
Thank you.
Then let me just very quickly repeat that the main finding of the report is that at least half of the member organizations are involved in actively reflecting and reviewing how they engage in research assessment. The leadership of these organizations, of course, is the most important player in terms of frequency of answers. And as a personal note, I would like to say that unfortunately, the individuals who have been or are likely to be assessed are much less frequently involved in this conversation, whereas possibly thinking about feedback mechanisms would also be important. What kind or if these organizations are involved in reforming their own assessment criteria at all? Well, in 1/3 of the cases they did, and they already implemented some changes in their assessment processes. In 2/3 of the cases they haven't yet. In particular, half of the sample hasn't really plans for a change in the way they assess researchers, whereas another third or fourth, more or less, are thinking about it, but not yet implementing changes. Where is reform occurring is one important question for the report, and it emerges that a lot of ideas about change come from young academies of science, including in the Global South, which is very important in the view. And among the possible reasons, as Ben was already mentioning before, is the fact that from the qualitative interviews, it emerges that a major driver of change is within the organizations themselves, rather than coming from outside, from founders or other outside players. However, there are also barriers to change, at least in two senses. One, because there is what culture bases call the first mover disadvantage in terms of more than one player expressing caution in terms of understanding that there are risks to be the first one to introduce change or innovation. Just to make an example, it could create problems in terms of mobility of researchers if different countries went too much in different directions, for example. So an example in terms of recognizing skills, careers, and so on. But also, some, especially young academies, could, especially in the Global South, could even feel like being less appreciated if they should change the criteria in which they define research quality or excellence in the first place. Another possible barrier to reform, one that was very much debated within our scoping group, is also the answer to this question. The survey respondents were asked what they think about the current methods of research assessment. And as you can see from the slide, there is quite a vast majority of respondents that have a mildly or strongly positive view of the current methods, and possibly therefore do not see excessively the need for change. There are different possible interpretations of this result. As I mentioned, this was one of the things that we had actively discussed quite a little bit in the scoping group. On the one hand, some members noted that we are referring here to the method of research evaluation within the organizations, so mostly in electing members of the senior or the young academies, and arguably some of these organizations already introduced innovations. We have seen before that there is a wide range of criteria already being used. On the other hand, Some argue that the worst aspects of research evaluation rather concern evaluation within universities or among funding bodies rather than the academies, possibly because, according to some members of our scoping group, excellence in a sense is easier to recognize than, for example, producing a whole complete ranking of researchers or research products. However, it is important in my view, and this is a personal reflection, to also highlight that, however, this result runs against the consensus on this literature. There is an emergent field of science. There are now specialized journals, there are very many papers being published every year that highlight, for example, that current methods of research evaluation can lead to indirect discrimination, which is the application of the same criteria to different cases that can result in unfair result and evaluation. It can lead to strategic behavior, goal displacement, basically changing the incentives for the researchers, especially those in more vulnerable conditions. It can even lead to mental issues for many, for example, early career researchers. Moreover, there is a positive case for pushing for change in the current methods of research evaluation. One being the importance of maintaining research quality as opposed, for example, to mere quantity, protecting research integrity, maximizing inclusion and diversity within the scientific community, trying to reach this important goal of making of science a global public good, as well as answering to new challenging from the importance of moving toward a truly open science ecosystem to the impact of new technologies such as, for example, generative artificial intelligence. So a positive case exists, even though we are, of course, aware of challenges, being, for example, that nobody has yet come out with a perfect method to assess researchers. Both metrics-driven and qualitative, for example, peer review process have their own problems, and this is quite clear for those of us who have looked into the issue. Not necessarily everyone agrees on how to even define research quality, research excellence, and so what are the ultimate goals, as well as, of course, there are risks in introducing completely new methods that are not yet been fully tested with due process. In this road, therefore, it is a shared view and expressed in the report as well, that there is a big value added of cooperation between the three organizations from 2 points of view. First of all, because they truly have a global reach, as well as because of the diversity of scope of its members. Many different kinds of organizations, institutions can be mobilized, and this can be very important in producing some form of coordination and not just cooperation. And indeed, coordination and cooperation has been a priority voiced by the respondents of the survey. There is a strong need, especially, as I was mentioning before, expressed by organizations based in the Global South. This is something that comes also from our previous work with the first report. There are organizations that feel not fully included in the global conversation, as well as there is a risk of fragmentation. Currently, we see the DORA on the one hand, the European Union-based CoARA on this side of the world. However, at the same time, there is Flaxo and other important initiatives in Latin America, and it's important to produce some form of shared goals and possibly to some extent coordination among the regional alternatives in order to preserve the mobility of researchers as well as some fair and wide debate. So there is also examples mentioned in the report of collaboration piecemeal happening already, for example, between the senior and the young academies in some countries, or between senior academies in some other countries. However, this idea that many organizations don't like to be the only ones or don't like to be the first ones to introduce innovations really is a need that emerged quite clearly. Now, moving towards the conclusions, as Ben was mentioning before, the report closes with a typology of organizations that have been interviewed, ranging from those who are already engaging in reforming research assessment and trying to introduce innovations, to those who are possibly more cautiously going there, maybe studying changes that could be made, but they're not yet implemented. Then we have observed a number of institutions involved in our networks that would be interested, that see the problem, but they currently feel excluded from the global debate, or they don't feel empowered to act in a meaningful direction yet. And then there are those who are new to the agenda, or again, if I could make a personal comment, those who could even be a little bit skeptical, possibly, in the sense that, as I was mentioning, there is a very big literature on the current pitfalls of research evaluation methods, but probably this is not enough yet common knowledge within all of the networks of the three organizations. So the conclusions of the report are a huge space, a huge room for cooperation between the three organizations in terms of championing missing voices, so making the debate more inclusive, using the names to lend credibility to the reform agenda, supporting some interventions that we think or we hope have already reached a certain degree of agreement among scholars who are studying what to do, how to change research assessment, protecting research and mobility, so as I was mentioning, trying to establish a minimum level of coordination between regional initiatives that are already undergoing, and promoting the exchange of ideas, good practices, but even bad practices if they can be lessons to be learned from the other organizations. And finally, let me also, let me also conclude with one personal comment as well, yes, which is to make clearer the conclusions of the report and also to provide a personal interpretation. It seems to me there is really a very good room for maneuver, if you want, or possible value added in the cooperation between the three organizations. What we see currently, in my view, is a collective action problem. Many members of our networks see the need to do things differently, but nobody wants to be the only one or the first one to change. So there is a need for some form of coordination that hopefully the three organizations can provide. And hopefully they can do it in a way that makes the debate really global. Because when we wrote the first report, it emerged quite clearly that organizations in the global south feel that it has taken them some time to learn the the rules of the game, and now the global north is changing them again. This should not be the way we introduce reform, as well as making an inclusive debate. All perspectives should hopefully be heard. Then there is again a room for providing intellectual leadership. I'm even thinking of consensus conferences or a web fora in which one could discuss, many organizations hopefully could discuss what is the impact of new technologies on research evaluation, how to reform peer review, and so on. And finally, it could also come to a moment in which maybe a coordinated push could be what is really needed. We are not proposing a one-size-fits-all model. However, when sufficient evidence emerges that specific changes can be beneficial without having too many risks or too many costs, there would be a lot of value added in trying to push for them simultaneously in many places at the same time in order to overcome this collective action problem that was mentioned. These are just my own personal observations reading the report, but I do encourage everyone to download it. It's freely available on the three organizations' websites. And I thank again Culture Base for having helped in drafting it.
Great, thank you so much, Carlo and Ben, for introducing the report itself and giving us a quick overview of what's in it. So I think it's now an opportunity to continue this kind of consultation process. So I think I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience has got questions about the report itself or suggestions as to what should be the next steps. Please feel free to raise your hand or to just chip in. It's not a particularly formal process today. Whilst people are thinking of their questions, I mean, in addition to your guiding prompts, I think there's a number of things that we can also think about. Might be useful in terms of community engagement to think about what we missed in this report. I think as Carlo pointed out, we have quite a significant overlap of our different communities between the ISC, between GYA, and between the Inter-Academy Partnership. But we don't have a huge amount of overlap in terms of funders who might be setting the agenda when it comes to what kind of evaluations are required. And of course, in terms of universities as members, where a lot of the day-to-day promotion, assessment for promotion is happening. So how do we leverage those connections? Carlo, do you want to come in with an idea or two there on our brainstorming, or what do we think we should do?
Well, universities have their own associations. For the moment, CoARA is very much focusing on that. That is my impression, at least. Again, there is a risk that this becomes only a regional initiative. So it would be, for example, very interesting, in my view, to try to connect together regional organizations of universities from different areas of the world. There is a real risk of fragmentation in terms of separate reform agendas moving in different dimensions, all with good intentions, of course, but this would be an important obstacle to mobility then in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Although, part of the complexity of the debate is around the fact that different universities and different regions might have different priorities. And I think that was one of the things that came up yesterday. It's not easy to have a set of metrics that's consistent across the globe and across disciplines and all those kinds of things. So maybe I can also ask, I'm just taking the job of asking you guys all the questions now. But Ben, one of the recommendations that came out of the report was around, things that are at the tipping point, initiatives that might just need a bit of an extra push. What are some of those things that are identified as being at the tipping point?
Absolutely, Vanessa. Yeah, I think it was really interesting to see this as a trend across the results, was that there's been various tools and kind of actions that people are trialing as interventions to try and change how a researcher assessment happens. I think the one that particularly came through quite strongly was around versions of narrative CVs. So these are kind of CV formats that are designed to be more flexible, allowing people to be more descriptive in the contributions that they make to different aspects of research, rather than a kind of more traditional CV where often it's kind of largely based around publication records. And we're really interested to see some of these kind of narrative formats being adopted in different places in the world. And there's a real sense that at the moment, you can prosper within one of those national systems using a narrative CV, because often they're adopted by kind of big funders. So here in the UK, for example, our major government funder, CoARA, has adopted them. You see in the Netherlands, places like Luxembourg, Switzerland. The challenge, I think, is that other systems aren't adopting them necessarily. So, you know, for the individual researcher, they're investing a lot of time and energy into a format that perhaps doesn't have translatability elsewhere in the world. And I think that's what we've kind of seen as this sense of a tipping point, which is effectively kind of critical mass in adoption of a particular type of intervention. And at the moment, certainly something like narrative CVs are at a point where in a handful of national systems, they are very much the kind of evolving as the kind of default format. But there are other systems that are really looking to that, waiting for a certain amount of evidence or confidence in order to take the same leap. And I think that's really what we're seeing as this kind of tipping point, which is a kind of concerted effort to collect that evidence, appraise it, and make a decision, I think could really release quite a large wave of secondary locations that might adopt these sorts of techniques. So I thought it was a really interesting result, actually. And from some of the conversations we had, a lot of places were very aware of this risk of becoming a kind of walled garden of a particular practice where everything outside was doing it differently. And there was a real desire to see a broader adoption. And I think it's trying to pick what has to happen for that change to occur. And I think for a lot of those interventions, it is around evidence. It's about showing that these things are effective and really understanding what the implications are for things like funders and universities, as you've mentioned, so that everyone in the system feels comfortable adopting those new techniques.
So thanks very much, Ben. We've got a question. Marie, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you. I think one of the things that came up in the conversations that we had was how equity, or the need for equity, whether it be for developing nations or for different groups within populations of scholars, how that could win out against the interests of, I guess, big capitalist interests of the publishers and the universities in cahoots in terms of university rankings and those sorts of things. You know, we didn't, I guess that is one of the challenges. How can we change a system when there's so much financial interest in maintaining the current system? I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but one of the challenges, I guess.
I think it's a comment that really demonstrates, you know, some of the difficulty in moving. We've often through our discussions said that, you know, we can look at researcher assessments as just one component in a whole system where you see, you know, publications as another, university rankings as another. And unless you kind of move all those gears together, you end up with the situation, I think, that Ben has spoken about, even being a walled garden in a different way, right? So it's a huge challenge. I mean, I'd be interested to hear from anyone online whether there are efforts, particular efforts that they are undertaking that might not be reflected in this report, or also what, from your perspectives, what can our organizations do apart from implementing some of these recommendations to really to move forward on this complex topic? So whilst we're waiting for those, Carlo, Ben, Beata, Rania, feel free to come in as well and especially address some perspectives on Laurie's comment.
If I might go first, Vanessa, if that's all right. Yeah, I think a really important comment, and actually that idea of equity was really strong throughout the report, as you've said. I think particularly we heard some real concerns about the idea that a process of reform could take place, you know, across the global community, but actually would effectively be set again by the same people who hold power in the current system. And that would mean that those who are most disadvantaged right now see that disadvantage perpetuated, even amongst new, supposedly better kind of rules and approaches. So there was a real desire, and we saw this across a lot of those who engaged in the survey and in the interviews, to ensure that that conversation was a genuine open field, that there was a real kind of equitable conversation about what better would look like, and making sure that the kind of future systems, future measures of success and excellence in the system really recognize the different contexts in which research is happening across the world. So yeah, I completely agree. I think it's absolutely essential that any reform has equity at the heart of it and really takes that into consideration when building new approaches.
Well, if I may, I would like to just follow up on the earlier discussion concerning the narrative CVs and being close to perhaps a tipping point, or being at least an initiative which has traction in different regions and where some experience are there. And it seems to me that narrative CVs perhaps have a power to influence more than just how a CV is presented. If this is a core element of researcher evaluation, other elements need to be weighted to that. And if there is a convincing narrative CV, it might have the power to override other factors like the impact factors, the publication lists, etc. So what is the feeling? Is this narrative CV also an element in the system of researcher evaluation which has the power or the capacity to influence other elements of the researcher evaluation? Then it would be perhaps worthwhile putting some, well, Carlo had in his closing ideas the idea of a coordinated push of the three organizations. Well, he had also earlier steps than doing the push. It was his third and not the first point, but let's just explore whether looking into the narrative CVs could be a thing where we unite together and try to push. Well, what is the impression or the opinion of others vis-a-vis these thoughts? Thanks.
If I may, then I should apologize for having used the term research assessment method. More correctly, Ben referred to processes. And I think this is one of the examples in which equity considerations can be important. Because, for example, if we should talk about the narrative CV, it's important not just to introduce this different method of assessment, but also to provide training and guidance to the applicants, especially those, for example, who are not native speakers, or those who are not sure about what are the policies, what are the reviewers looking at when they read a narrative CV. So, for example, training is an important component of changing the way we assess researchers, not just the method per se in terms of equity. And the second point, actually, Mary also mentioned the importance of vested interests and even corporations profiting from the current systems. I think this is very important to consider, not necessarily in an exclusionary way, in the sense that not necessarily every step of a reform process needs to imply that powerful corporations will lose a lot of money, of course, otherwise reform will become extremely difficult. So to make a concrete example again, some publishers have applied to join CoARA in the EU. They have not been admitted, or not yet at least, but it has been decided that they are important stakeholders. They will be involved in discussions and conversations. They will provide feedback and some forum for discussions, including, for example, the publishers who are among the actors of the research ecosystem in their own way.
Yeah, absolutely, Carla. Very good points. Any more suggestions on the way forward? I mean, I think it's interesting around these particular tipping points. I think one of the things that has come out of the report, or at least our broad discussion around it, is not having a kind of a single point of failure, or something, a one-size-fits-all approach. And whilst we might have some things that one can push across the finish line, it's worth bearing in mind that it's probably part of a suite of tools, isn't it? Anything else that people think is, particularly valuable in this suite of tools for researcher assessment or evaluation? No more burning questions or comments? Well, I think it's been fantastic to have some input. I think it's been really a good experience to see the community of our various organizations reflected in the report. Thank you again to CultureBase and for the rest of the team for putting that together and really consolidating what I think is sometimes quite disparate input into some really kind of condensed results and some recommendations for action. I think we'd like to keep the conversation going on behalf of the Global Young Academy, on behalf of the Inter-Academy Partnership and the IAC. We convened a meeting of some relevant experts a couple of weeks ago to discuss the next steps. And so our doors are open. We'd like to continue hearing from you, and please provide feedback on the report as we chart out a way forward, whether that is throwing our weight behind another organization or providing support to some of our member organizations, or maybe finding a collection of easily implementable steps towards reform. So thanks again to all my colleagues for being online for the presentation, and we'll speak to you again soon.